Hi everyone, this is going to be the second lesson on the topic of homeostasis and response for GCSE Biology students. In this lesson we're going to be taking a look at the structure and function of the human nervous system. So before we go any further, let's take a look at the learning objectives for today's lesson. So once you've completed watching this lesson video, and if you're watching it from within my website, there'll be a number of interactive questions that will pop up at intervals throughout this video for you to answer to check your understanding. Once you've completed those, and also the end of lesson quiz and the downloadable pack of exam questions that accompanies this topic, together with the other various learning activities on this lesson's page and within this topic, you should be able to do the following things. So in this lesson, we're going to start by taking a look at the overall structure of the human nervous system and its anatomical and functional divisions into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. We're also going to be taking a look at the way in which the general scheme of the way that homeostasis works that we encountered on that previous lesson, the last lesson, how that works within the nervous system itself. So we're going to be looking at, again, the idea of a stimulus, a receptor, a coordination center, an effector, and a response. And we're going to be looking at the various elements of the nervous system that satisfy those various functions within the homeostatic response to, and also the responses to stimuli by the nervous system. Now, in particular, to illustrate that, we're going to be looking at the simplest type of nervous system responses, which are reflex actions. So we're going to define what a reflex action is. We're going to be looking at the importance of reflex actions and how a reflex action works by a description of the structure and function of what we call a reflex arc. And this will illustrate the idea of stimulus, receptor, coordinator, effector, and response within the nervous system. Now, a number of different exam questions will be made available to you as part of the downloadable pack of exam questions that accompanies this topic, and also many of the end-of-lesson quizzes and other learning activities within this topic will make use of exam questions which will require you to interpret data about things like nervous system responses, reflex arcs, and things like that. So when it comes to these types of questions, the extraction and interpretation of data from tables, from charts, from graphs will be particularly important. So you're going to encounter these last couple of learning outcomes in those exam questions. Now again, given the fact that you've all enrolled on this course, again, you will have that pack of exam questions and you will get individualized marking and feedback for your efforts on those exam questions on that. So that should take care of these learning objectives. But as always, if you have any questions, then please do either send me those questions as private messages via this the student notes function on this lesson's page, in which case I'll respond to your questions within 24 hours. Alternatively, you can type your questions on the nervous system into the live chat on this lesson's page. Perhaps start a useful discussion with other students in which I will also respond. If you're watching this elsewhere, such as on YouTube, then please do type your questions about the nervous system into the comments and I'll respond to you guys there as well. Now, as always, I'm joined by a group of students via this Zoom application. Many of you have asked a number of questions concerning the nervous system and also the brain. I will be addressing the majority of those questions throughout the main recorded segment of this lesson. Some of the questions that you've asked get into kind of A-level and degree level territory, so I will be answering those questions in depth, but I'll be answering those in the Q&A discussion that will follow this lesson. So those of you in attendance with me, please do hold fire for that. And equally, if you could also, if any further questions occur to you during the recorded segment of this lesson at the beginning, please do type those into the Q&A box on your Zoom client, and also vote for the questions that have already been asked in the Q&A box. That way I can address those questions in the discussion in the order in which they receive votes. Okay, so let's start with the idea of receptors in the nervous system. So the body is covered in sensory receptors, which are effectively specialized nerve cells or neurons, which collect information about our surroundings. So we can see some of the receptors and their locations in the upper part of the body, in the head and the neck here. I'm just going to turn these labels on. So we're going to be looking at the eye in a later lesson within this topic, but within the eye we have photoreceptors within the retina, specialized cells called rods and cones, which can detect light and then turn that into nerve impulses, which can then be interpreted by the brain. In the ear we have We have cells which are specialized to detect vibration from sounds and then again transmit that information as nerve impulses to the brain. In the nose, we have what's called olfactory receptors, which are chemical receptors which are sensitive to particular chemicals in the air that we breathe, and these are interpreted as smells by the brain. On the tongue, we also have chemoreceptors, which are sensitive to various chemicals in the food that we eat. And again, these will send nerve impulses to the brain, which carry that information to the brain so that it can be interpreted by the brain. And in the skin, we have pressure receptors, we have pain receptors, we have temperature receptors, all of which are specialized neurons, nerve cells, which detect the changes in those various parameters in the skin. So if we take, for example, just the skin, within the skin, we have a number of different types of specialized neurons, nerve receptor cells. So here we have pressure receptors. These detect heavy pressure, and we can see here that they are in the deeper layers of the skin. So here we can see the cornified layer of dead cells at the surface. These deep pressure receptors detect heavy pressure and warn against possible damage to the body. Here we see the lighter pressure receptors nearer the surface. These are the ones responsible for the fine sense of touch, and we also have pain receptors, which are triggered by the breaking of the skin. And again, this is detected by the brain when these specialized nerve cells send signals to the brain. Now, we also have in other parts of the skin other types of specialized receptors. Around the hair follicles, we have hair movement sensors, and these receptors, these specialized nerve cells, their endings will coil around the roots of hairs, and they detect hair movement and also detect if the hair is being pulled. Here we can see temperature receptors which detect heat, and here we can see temperature receptors which detect cold. Again, all of these are specialized neurons or nerve cells. So we can demonstrate the idea of temperature sensation with a very simple demonstration, which perhaps you have either taken part in yourself in the school science laboratory or have seen demonstrated. So we prepare 3 beakers, one with relatively hot but not scalding water, one with ice cold water, and one with room temperature or lukewarm water. We place our hands in the hot and the cold water, as shown here, and then we keep them there for about a minute, and then we take them out of those 2 beakers and we place them into the lukewarm beaker. Now what we'll find is both of our hands now feel different even though they are in a beaker of water at the same temperature. So the question is, why is this, and what does this demonstrate about our temperature sense? So I'd be interested to know your answers to that question. I'll leave that open for you guys to answer. Please do type your answers into either the live chat on this lesson's page or send me your answers privately if you prefer to do so. Obviously, if you're watching this elsewhere, such as on YouTube, and you're not registered or enrolled on my GCSE Biology course, you guys can obviously send me your responses in the comments and I'll be happy to respond there as well. I think this is actually a very interesting demonstration on a biological level for the purposes of answering this question, but also from the purposes of physics, where we learn that temperature is a measure of the relative degree of hotness or coldness, but because of the subjectivity of temperature, as is demonstrated by this simple demonstration, it requires an operational definition by measurement using instruments rather than just by subjectively feeling how hot or cold something is. And it also requires a theoretical definition because, again, the various temperature scales and the various thermometers and instruments that we use to measure temperature themselves have issues. And so it's quite an interesting demonstration that you might have seen both in your biology classes but also in your physics classes as well. Now, bad tastes are actually a warning that you may have consumed something which is harmful to you, and so you can then spit that food out. Pleasant tastes are pleasurable, and this encourages us to eat more of those foods. Both of these are actually survival responses at their root. So on the tongue, we have various regions of the tongue which are sensitive to different types of tastes because they contain different types of chemical receptors, chemoreceptors, which are sensitive to different types of chemicals. So you can see the various regions and what they're sensitive to here. So the nervous system consists of the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves which connect the brain and spinal cord to the peripheries of the body. So we can divide the nervous system into two general kind of anatomical branches. We have the brain and spinal cord, which make up the central nervous system, and we have the nerves which run between the brain and spinal cord and between the central nervous system to the various other structures in the body, and this is referred to as the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, is coloured in red in this diagram, and the peripheral nervous system is coloured in blue here. So the nervous system essentially overall enables us to react to our surroundings and coordinate our behaviour. The central nervous system coordinates the senses and the body's responses to those sensations. Now, the nerves which make up the peripheral nervous system are responsible for carrying information from sensory receptors to the central nervous system, and also carrying signals from the central nervous system to effector organs such as muscles and glands to produce certain types of effects. Now, each nerve is actually a bundle of the axons of nerve cells, the long thin fibers of the nerve cells, and these individual nerve cells are called neurons. Now, I'm showing the English spelling of the word neuron here. The American spelling is spelled without an E, so you may see both of those spellings. So here we see the brain, we see the spinal cord, and together these make up the central nervous system. The nerves, which are bundles of neuron fibers, these make up the peripheral nervous system. So if we take one of these nerves and we examine it more closely, we'll find a connective tissue sheath around it, and within the center of the nerve we find many individual fibers of nerve cells or neurons. Now, the next lesson is going to be one where we look at the brain in a lot more detail, but it bears mentioning here. So the brain has the following functions. It coordinates unconscious activities such as heartbeat, breathing, and body temperature regulation. It also coordinates conscious activities such as walking, dancing, cycling, and decision making. And so the mental activities, the thinking, reading, and writing, also are controlled by the brain, and it's also a store of memories. So these are the general functions of the brain, and of course the skull is the bony protective enclosure that protects the brain. So the spinal cord emerges from the back part of the brain, and it's a thick bundle of nerves essentially that carries impulses to and from the brain, and it's actually a continuation of a region of the brain referred to as the medulla. So the spinal cord is essentially a tube of nerve tissue which runs from the brain to the lower back through the neural canals within the vertebrae. So we can see here within the vertebrae there is a space through which the spinal cord runs. Now, being enclosed by the vertebrae protects the spinal cord while still allowing the spinal cord to flex when the back and the body is flexed and twisted. So it's essentially a protective assembly of bones which articulate against each other. So here we can see a section, or rather a top-down view of one of the thoracic vertebrae, the vertebrae in the thorax, in the chest region. So here we can see the spinal cord, and here we can see from the external view the individual vertebrae with the discs of cartilage between them here. And in the middle of this thoracic vertebra, like all vertebrae, there is a space through which the spinal cord runs, and this is called the neural canal. Here we can see a transverse section through the spinal cord which has been stained to show the two different types of tissue, the white matter and the grey matter. The white matter is neural tissue composed mainly of the axons of nerve cells, and the grey matter is composed of cell bodies. So this is a diagrammatic representation of a section through the spinal cord as shown here, and here we can see the various parts. This is called the dorsal root. This is called the dorsal root ganglion. Here we see the spinal nerve emerging from the ventral side of the spinal cord. Here we can see the ventral root. Here we can see the white matter, and the white matter again consists mainly of the myelinated nerve fibers that carry impulses up and down the cord. And here we can see the butterfly-shaped grey matter region containing many cell bodies and also relay neurons or intermediate neurons. Now, we're going to be examining each one of these aspects of the spinal cord, these various anatomical parts of the spinal cord in later lessons and within this lesson in a bit more detail. And we're also going to be looking at what we mean by the axon and the cell bodies of neurons in this lesson and also later lessons as well. So once again, here we can see the spinal cord, and this is a view of the spinal cord showing the dorsal and ventral roots and the spinal nerves that come from those at various levels and how that relates to the positions of these vertebrae. So this is the spinal cord here. Now here we can see a ganglion. Now the word ganglion refers to a collection, a bundle of cell bodies, essentially. This is where you find the cell bodies, and we're going to see more of that when we look at reflex actions and the reflex arc a little bit later on. Here we can see a vertebra, and here we can see the hole between the two articulating vertebrae adjacent to each other through which these spinal nerves pass as they come out through the hole between those two vertebrae. So these are spinal nerves, and they emerge at various levels of the spine. So here we can see the centrum, the central bony region of this vertebra. And if we examine this spinal nerve, we'll find that it's enclosed in a connective tissue sheath within which you have bundles of nerve fibers, each of which are enclosed within their own internal sheath, as shown here. So this is one bundle of nerve fibers, and within this bundle of nerve fibers, we see here the many different axons, the fibers of individual nerve cells running along this nerve. So if we examine this in a little bit more detail, we would see individual nerve fibers. So the nerve fibers, so this is one axon of a single nerve cell magnified, and we see that it's surrounded by a fatty myelin sheath. Now we're going to be talking about the function of these myelin sheaths a little bit later on. So here we can see a nerve cell with one nerve fiber highly magnified here, and we can see here the myelin sheath of one nerve fiber. Now within the myelin sheath is the axon of the nerve cell, and sometimes these can also be dendrons. Now if you're watching this video on my website, this exercise will pop up and you'll be able to answer it interactively, so go ahead and do that. If you're watching elsewhere, perhaps pause the video and see if you can use the words at the bottom of this to fill in the gaps correctly. So there are two main types of nerve cells in the peripheral nervous system. There are sensory neurons and there are motor neurons. Sensory neurons are sometimes called afferent neurons. The word afferent is often used in anatomy to describe a structure which conveys something towards something central. So in this case, it's afferent in the sense that sensory neurons convey information towards the central nervous system. Motor neurons are sometimes called efferent neurons. Efferent neurons are neurons which carry information from the central nervous system to effectors, usually muscles or glands. So efferent generally means when a structure is passing something, is conveying something away from something central. So the two main types of neurons are sensory neurons, which carry sensory information to the central nervous system, and motor neurons, which carry information to effectors from the central nervous system. So sense organs, such as the eye, will contain sensory receptors. In the case of the eye, those are the rod and cone cells, and these will carry information as sensory neurons to the central nervous system, where that information is processed. So we have the receptor, and we have the coordination center. Now the motor neurons carry information from the central nervous system, from a region of the brain called the motor cortex, and also from regions of the spinal cord to motors or effectors. And effectors are organs such as muscles or glands which produce effects. So this diagram, the brown gland on top of the kidney here is the adrenal gland. This releases adrenaline in response to signals from the central nervous system. So we've been mentioning that the cells that make up the nervous system are called neurons. So let's take a look at the structure and function of a neuron now. So your nervous system contains many millions, in fact billions of neurons. The brain contains somewhere between 86 and 120 billion neurons, depending on who you ask. Now that's an enormous number of neurons. That's comparable to the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. Again, it's thought to be somewhere between 200 and 400 billion stars. Now, if you take the number of interconnections between the neurons in the nervous system, so as we can see here, this is one neuron. We can see the cell body with these many projections, these tree-like projections called dendrites. These dendrites will connect to other surrounding nerve cells, and this neuron sends signals long distances via this axon to things like muscle cells or glands. This is a motor neuron, and so this one neuron could connect to many hundreds or even thousands of surrounding neurons. Now, if you think about the number of neurons in the average brain, somewhere between 86 and 120 billion, and then work out the number of interconnections between those, it's thought to be something like 125 trillion connections between your neurons in your brain. Now that's such an enormous number. To put that in context, that's the same number of stars as about 1,500 Milky Way galaxies. This gives you a sense of just the sheer complexity of the brain. So let's take a look at the structure of neurons in general. Unlike most body cells, neurons consist of a cell body attached by long, thin nerve fibers. Now, in the case of motor neurons, these can be up to a meter long. Nerve impulses travel along nerve fibers in one direction only. So this next slide shows a electron micrograph of nerve cells, and as you can see, they have this highly branched structure. Now, there are three main types of neurons in the nervous system. There are the sensory neurons found in the peripheral nervous system. There are the motor neurons, the fibers of which are also found in the peripheral nervous system. Their cell bodies are found mainly in the central nervous system. And then you have the neurons which sit in between the sensory and the motor neurons. These are sometimes called relay neurons or intermediate neurons. Now, all three of these different types of neurons have a distinct shape, which is slightly different from each other. They all share certain common characteristics, but they do have certain differences between them. So let's take a look at those in the next few slides here. So once again, these are the three main types. They all share certain things in common, but they do have different morphologies because they have slightly different functions within the nervous system. So nerve impulses are signals which are sent along neurons and between and end up being sent across the gaps between neurons called synapses. These are the ways in which information is carried to and from the central nervous system and the way that information is passed within the central nervous system itself. So nerve impulses, it's important to remember that these are not electrical impulses. Many people will say that the brain is an electrical organ or that nerve impulses are electrical. Strictly speaking, that's not the case. Electrical refers to electricity, which is a flow generally of electrons. It's not really electrons that transfer the information. And so your nervous system doesn't work like a system of wires, such as in an electrical machine. Nerve impulses are in fact electrochemical waves, which travel as waves of depolarization across the surfaces of nerve cells. And so it's better to think of the nervous system as an electrochemical system, if we're being very rigorous with our language. But in any case, nerve impulses are produced when a sense organ receives a stimulus. So if we take the example of the eye, which again we're going to be looking at a little bit later on in a lesson of its own within this topic, the eye contains photoreceptive cells called rods and cones. So this is a cone cell being shown in this diagram. So for example, when light enters the eye, receptors in the retina of the eye convert the photon's energy, the light energy, into nerve impulses, which then travel along sensory neurons to a region of the brain called the occipital cortex, which then processes that information. So the cone cells, like this one, detect color, and the rod cells are only active in low light intensity. Now, sensory neurons, again, convey nerve impulses from sense organs generally, and so the impulses are processed to give us our sensations, things like our perception of sight, smell, touch, taste, etc. And so you generally will have a sensory region within the neuron which is responsive to some kind of stimulus, whether it's touch or some chemical receptor in the tongue or in the nose, or photoreceptors in the eye. Whatever it is, you have some region of this sensory neuron which is receptive, which is responsive to some kind of stimulus. Now, this stimulus will then trigger a electrochemical impulse called a nerve impulse or an action potential, and this travels along the long, thin region of this nerve, which is abbreviated here, called the axon. So what we have here is information being carried from a sensory nerve ending along a sensory neuron along the axon of that cell towards the other end of the cell, which is in the central nervous system. So here we have a gap in the insulating sheath. These are called nodes of Ranvier, and the insulating sheath is made up of what we call a myelin sheath. And at the other end, we have the branches of the axon of this sensory neuron, which are actually inside the central nervous system. So this is the direction that the information is being carried. So here we can see the cell body of the sensory neuron. Now the cell body of a sensory neuron is usually somewhere along its axon. So here we can see the axon. So the axon is the long thread-like portion of the neuron, whether it's a sensory neuron or a motor neuron. And myelinated axons have this insulating sheath around them, which have these gaps called nodes of Ranvier. So this is the general structure of a sensory neuron. Now again, if you're watching this on my website from within the GCSE Biology course, this activity will shortly pop up and allow you to answer it interactively by dragging the words at the bottom of this into the gaps. If you're watching this elsewhere, such as on YouTube, then go ahead and pause the video and see if you can fill in the gaps in this passage correctly. So let's take a look at the actual connections between neurons, and these are called synapses. So a synapse is essentially a tiny gap between one neuron and another, and the impulse that carries the information from one neuron somehow has to get across, or rather the information has to get across that gap. So the neuron carrying the impulse, in this case this neuron here, so this is a presynaptic neuron, the neuron which carries information to the synapse, to this gap. The presynaptic neuron has this, what we call a synaptic knob. So this is a blown up view of a synapse. So this is a synaptic knob of the presynaptic neuron. Once the impulse reaches this synaptic knob, this triggers the release of a chemical called a neurotransmitter from the presynaptic membrane. That then diffuses across this gap to the postsynaptic membrane, the membrane of the second cell, and these neurotransmitter molecules will fit into receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. This then causes the postsynaptic membrane to fire its own impulse, which then travels down the second neuron. So this is essentially the way that nerve impulses are transferred across synapses. Now, the chemicals needed for the impulses to jump from the presynaptic neuron across the synaptic cleft, the gap of the synapse, to the postsynaptic neuron, these are only produced when many impulses per second are traveling along the neural pathway to the presynaptic neuron's membrane. So only strong stimuli will result in a response by an effector organ. Weak stimuli can't produce a response because they fail to produce a release of neurotransmitter across that synapse. So this essentially is a protective mechanism. Otherwise, even the slightest stimulus would excite every nerve in the body and send us essentially into convulsions. Now, the impulse can only travel across a synapse in one direction. Now, the advantage of this is that it gives the body control over the effectors and only responds to sensors. So a motor neuron has a slightly different structure to a sensory neuron. A motor neuron has a cell body with many dendrites, these long tree-like projections. Now, as we can see here, this motor neuron cell body is receiving synapses from many surrounding neurons here. So we can see here the direction of the nerve impulse traveling from the cell body down the axon, which is not shown here towards the bottom. So here we can see a dendrite from a surrounding neuron, which is forming a synapse on this dendron. Here we can see the nucleus of the cell body here, and the impulse which is received via these synapses on the cell body ultimately can trigger another action potential, another nerve impulse, which then travels from here down the axon of this neuron here. So this is essentially the structure of a motor neuron, and we can see many synaptic knobs, which are points of connection between surrounding neurons, which may be relay neurons, and this particular motor neuron. So once again, we see the axon emerging from the cell body here, and it's a myelinated axon. It's surrounded by this insulating sheath. Now, motor neurons will work by conveying nerve impulses out of the central nervous system, which is where their cell bodies are located, to effector organs such as muscle fibers. So here we can see a motor neuron which is relaying or carrying information from the central nervous system to muscle cells. So the impulses from this motor neuron will cause these two muscle fibers, these two muscle cells, to contract. But it can also cause glands to release secretions as well. So when the impulse reaches the effector organ, whether it's a muscle or a gland, it results in a response. Muscles will respond by contracting, and this causes movement. Glands will respond by producing chemicals and releasing them, such as digestive juices. So here we can see the direction of nerve impulse traveling along the axon of this motor neuron. Here we can see the motor neuron cell body, and here we can see that it's synapsing onto muscle fibers. So here we can see the dendrites, which form connections with other neurons surrounding this one, which are not shown in this diagram. Here we can see the nucleus, and here we see the axon and also the myelinated sheath of the axon as well. Now here we can see where this motor neuron forms a connection with these the cell membranes of these muscle cells. Now this is called a motor end plate. Whenever you see a motor neuron forming a connection at this end of it onto muscle cells, these are called motor end plates, where you find numerous neuromuscular junctions. So once again, have a go at this activity for yourselves. So let's get on to reflex actions then. So a reflex action is a very simple type of response. It's a rapid automatic response to a stimulus, and that's a fairly good definition for what we mean by reflex action. Now, simple reflexes are inborn fixed responses to specific stimuli, and these involve either the brain or just the spinal cord. Reflex actions involve receptors, sensory neurons, motor neurons, and effectors, and these form a pathway called a reflex arc, and this pathway is essentially made up of neurons carrying information about the stimulus from the receptor and conveying that information ultimately to an effector organ, such as a muscle. Now, reflexes that operate via the spinal cord and don't involve the brain, these are called spinal reflexes, and these include pathways that determine actions such as the withdrawal response. So we see here somebody who's just accidentally hammered onto their thumb. The action whereby this person immediately withdraws their hand is an immediate, automatic, unconscious response. It doesn't require thought. It's all happens at the level of the spinal cord. So this would be an example of a spinal response or a spinal reflex. Now, spinal reflexes are almost all protective reflexes. Now, reflexes have value because they protect the body from harmful stimuli. They require no conscious thought because a conscious decision would take longer, and any delay in responding to a noxious or a harmful stimulus could lead to more physical damage or danger. And so the evolution of these spinal protective responses is an essential function to protect us from harm by withdrawing our body away from noxious or harmful stimuli as rapidly as possible. So the withdrawal reflex, which I've just described, where we touch something or some region of our body encounters some kind of painful or harmful stimulus, and immediately our muscles will react by withdrawing that part of our body away from that stimulus. This is called the withdrawal reflex, and this usually involves 3 neurons: a motor neuron, a sensory neuron, and a relay neuron somewhere in the central nervous system, usually in the spinal cord. So if you bang your hand with a hammer, that's the stimulus. You will pull your hand away, and that's the response, and you'll probably yell with pain. And this happens by means of a neural pathway called a reflex arc. So the events from the stimulus to the response are as follows. So you have the stimulus. In this case, it is the detection of the pain from banging your hand with the hammer. And a stimulus, remember, is always some kind of change in the internal or external environment. So this is detected by a receptor, which is a sensory organ. Now, in this case, that would be a pain receptor in the skin, or in the deep tissues. So a receptor in general is a sense organ which is stimulated by the stimulus, and in this case sensory neurons are activated, which then send a nerve impulse along that sensory neuron's axon, ultimately to the central nervous system. Now, the central nervous system is the coordination center. Now, in this case, that's the brain and the spinal cord. This is where you find relay neurons. These take the impulse from the sensory neuron and immediately will pass it on, will relay it to a motor neuron. So the motor neuron then carries that information to an effector, which in the case of the withdrawal response is going to be a muscle, but it can also be a gland. The effector then initiates the response. Now, in the withdrawal reflex, that response is to contract a muscle group, which then brings your hand away from the painful stimulus. So we see here that scheme that we saw before. You have a stimulus, a receptor, a coordination center, an effector, and a response. So let's take a look at the reflex arc then. Reflex arcs will produce a fast response because impulses pass along a very simple nerve pathway involving very few neurons, usually 3 neurons, but sometimes even as few as 2 neurons. So this diagram here shows a section through the spinal cord that we saw before, and this illustrates the 3 neurons involved in a reflex arc. So first of all, you have the harmful stimulus, such as, for example, touching something hot or banging your fingertip with a hammer. This is detected by receptors, in this case sensory neurons in the skin, pain receptors. Now these sensory neurons then send that signal, those nerve impulses, to the spinal cord, and those sensory neurons then synapse onto a relay neuron. That relay neuron is found within the spinal cord, and its only job is to immediately convey that impulse via another synapse to the cell body of a motor neuron. So that motor neuron then sends an impulse of its own to an effector, which is muscles on the arm, and the response which is triggered by that is the contraction of the muscles, which then draws the hand away from the harmful stimulus. Now, there are many other examples of reflex actions. So, for example, the production of tears by the eyes to wash dust away from the eyes. The control of the size of the pupil to protect the light from bright light and also to help vision in dim light. We're going to be looking at that in a later lesson of this topic. Another example of a reflex action is the blink reflex. When something touches the eye or the eyelashes, immediately our eyes will blink, and this is caused by another reflex arc. So here we can test this by taking a small pipette and puffing a little bit of air towards an open eye, towards one of our eyes which is open. This then immediately causes sensory neurons to send impulses to relay neurons in the spinal cord, which then immediately relay that to the motor neurons which control the muscles in the eyelid, and that causes an immediate blink to protect the eye. Another example would be coughing to remove blockage from the windpipe. This is also a reflex response. Shivering caused by muscles to keep the body warm. That's another reflex response. So when we shiver, the muscular contractions produce heat from respiration of the muscle cells, and this helps us to maintain our body temperature. Another example would be the stimulation of the production of saliva and gastric juices in the expectation or the sight or the smell of food. So the presence of food in the mouth, the sight or the smell of food, or even the thought of food can produce the secretion of saliva and gastric juices in the stomach, and these all happen by means of reflex arcs. Now, the simplest reflex is the knee-jerk reflex, and this is familiar to most people who've been to the doctor at some point. And this has given rise in the English language to the phrase knee-jerk reaction. The knee-jerk reflex is very simple because it only involves two neurons. In other words, there is a direct connection between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron without any relay neuron in between, and this is actually quite unusual. Now, because there is no relay neuron, the reflex only involves one synapse, and it's referred to as a monosynaptic reflex. Now, the function of this is that if a person was to lose balance and start to fall over, then the kick resulting from the patellar reflex should give just enough height to allow the person to regain their footing. So what's happening here is the doctor is using what's called a patellar hammer, and he's sharply tapping the tendon just underneath the kneecap here. That then triggers a reflex which causes the contraction of the thigh muscles, which then results in a little kick. So again, here is a exercise for you guys to try for yourselves. If you're watching it on my website, this will pop up and allow you to drag the words from the lower part of it into the gaps interactively. If you're watching it elsewhere, go ahead and pause the video and see if you can fill that in for yourselves. Okay, everyone, that's going to do it for the recorded segment of this lesson. I hope that was useful to you. I'm going to go into the Q&A discussion now with the students that I have in attendance with me via Zoom. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.